Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian, and hope everybody's having a very happy Easter. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. As the coronavirus death toll tops 112,000 worldwide, more than 21,000 of whom are Americans, Congress has been discussing the contours of another $1 trillion plus stimulus package. Boeing has reopened Puget Sound production facilities as Airbus cuts production. Here to discuss the week on world markets are Dr. Rocket Ron Epstein of Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Sash Tusa of the independent equity research firm Agency Partners, and Richard Abalafia of the Teal Group Consultancy. Guys, welcome back to the program. And happy Easter to you all.
Great to be here, Vago. Thank you.
Thanks, Vago. Happy Easter to you.
And a very happy Easter to you and all the listeners.
Thanks very much, all. Before we get started, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our cyber coverage overall. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And, of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Ron, start us off. The markets were up last week, even as death tolls mounted at an alarming rate, and that there's a recognition that this crisis is more likely than not going to span a lot longer than anybody thought. What's driving market optimism, and what does the street want to see from its next stimulus package? And whether governments are, last week it was said that Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, was using every bazooka in his arsenal, and the concern that we've had is eventually you run out of bazookas. So talk to us about a little bit of the broader sort of market dynamic that we find ourselves in.
Sure. So just to put some numbers around it, last week the S&P was up about 12%, the Dow was up about 13%, and to put that in perspective, that was the best one-week performance since 1974. So it was just a pure market performance week, a very strong week, at least historically. Now you have to remember, in the backdrop of a broader bear market, you can have bear market rallies, right? So last week would probably qualify as a bear market rally. In these kind of markets, there's tremendous swings in terms of sentiment, and I think that's part of what you saw. The market also was reacting to the Fed's support, like you mentioned, the kind of across the board. The Fed has been hugely supportive of the market in terms of forming a backstop in various forms. So that ultimately would have to get reflected in the market. What I think you'll see, right, and again, I'm not the strategist at Merrill Lynch or anything, but just kind of from years of looking at least our space, is just increased volatility from, we've seen it already. We saw volatility really spike over the last couple of weeks. I think you'll continue to see that as the market digests what's going on with the impact of the virus, the length and duration of this, if indeed there's going to be a second wave, and how all that's going to play out. Some of the other news, we heard this week, was with Boeing. You mentioned that they were going to recall some workers. I think they, at least in the press, it said they're going to recall about 2,500 workers out of 30,000. That's some, but it's not a ton. And the 2,500 they're bringing back, I believe the purpose is to focus on the P-8 program, the KC-46 program, and right, the folks that are maintaining the 737s, those approximately 400 737s that are in storage, that are waiting to get certified, to get delivered. So, kind of that, I think that kind of gives you a backdrop. But I would expect, as we go into this week and the following weeks, a very high level of volatility. And, I guess don't be faked out by this rally, right? I mean, this is right, a rally, one of many, and there's going to be ups and downs, right? That's just how it's going to go.
And what does the street want to see, before I go to the rest of the team, what does the street want to see from the U.S. government by way of another stimulus package, right? I mean, lawmakers have been working on the fourth tranche. There was an expectation more progress would have been made. It didn't. It fell apart along partisan lines. But what does the street want to see?
Yeah, I think
there
hasn't been a ton of discussion about that among my investor base, because they tend to be more focused on, particularly on industrials, particularly on aerospace and defense companies. That being said, my sense is I think one of the things the street wants to see is increased spending on infrastructure, among other things. And then also on the previous tranches that have been released, some closure with the airlines. And I know we'll talk about this later, some closure with Boeing, if any, and just kind of getting what has already been passed as law into the system and working. I think just this weekend, or maybe early this week, the first checks will be leaving the IRS and deposited into bank accounts of just individuals in the country. But seeing the first pieces of stimulus actually have an impact. But I think with another stimulus event, I think it's the focus is more on infrastructure spending, which will have a limited impact on A&D.
Sash, what do European investors want to see from central bankers at this point? I know that there was a little bit of stalled work by the EU on a bond issue, again, sort of a northern southern European divide going on there. But what do European investors want to see, and how much of what Washington is doing is really moving any needles over on the other side of the Atlantic?
What Washington's doing is pretty much immaterial over in Europe. I mean, all these stimulus packages are essentially various forms of band-aid. None of them are as important as actually resolving the virus, as getting the infection rates down, getting the death rates down, and then letting the various European economies, and I presume also the US economies, come out of lockdown and start to grow again. But the stimuluses are very, very important in terms of human beings, people who have been furloughed or who have lost their jobs. But actually, they have next to no impact on the companies that we cover and their respective prospects. The European Union, European Central Bank are trying very hard to come up with packages that will, in some ways, put some liquidity into credit markets. I mean, the Bank of England is resorting to effectively printing money. The most simple form of helicopter money in the business. Just let the printers go, because interest rates are low. Nobody cares about the long-term debt consequences at the moment. What they care about is the fact that as long as the economies are in lockdown, then the GDP figures are absolutely shocking. So, sort out the lockdown, i.e. sort out the virus, everything else can follow. But stimulus here, stimulus there is pretty unimportant by comparison. And just to add to Ron's point, he's absolutely right. Bear market rallies are lethal to get sucked into. And there's a real chronic shortage of liquidity in equity markets at the moment. It doesn't take very much, an order here and an order there, a tiny bit of news flow here or there to cause 5% moves in share prices. I've given up. I used to have all my share prices on 5% limits because I thought that would be incredibly important. We're getting 5% ups and downs every day. I'm just ignoring those now because I know that there's no liquidity behind that.
One of the things, though, that the Fed and central bankers are trying to do is inject liquidity into these markets. The question is whether or not they run out of bazookas, as the saying goes. Is there any sense that we're at the end of this, or is it, as you said, just keep the printers running and that solves the problem?
Just keep the printers running. The bazookas, or whichever analogy we use, are ineffectual. Frankly, they really are. I mean, I think the interesting thing, the stuff that works in terms of people who were working and have now been furloughed are the direct subventions by governments, whether it's the Kurzarbeit in Germany, its equivalent in France, or the furlough scheme in the UK, where if you get furloughed, roughly 80% of your salary gets paid. And this means that firms don't have to immediately make people redundant. That's what works. The rest of it is neither here nor there. And certainly in terms of share prices, which is what we focus on, no.
Richard, let me bring into the conversation about airlines, as Ron sort of mentioned. And if you want to talk about the broader economic picture, please feel free to do so. But where do we stand on sort of the impact on the overall ecosystem? And maybe you can try to also explain to us and help shift the conversation as well a little bit onto Boeing and what Boeing wants out of a deal from the federal government, because we've seen sort of this, they were going to be part of the bailout package. There's money in the bailout package, but there's negotiations. Dave Calhoun said that, well, we can tap capital markets. And at the end of the day, their supply chain is looking at this with a little bit of both wonder and frustration, right? Sort of talk to us about all of these elements, given that you've been writing about all of them.
Yeah, it's sort of I'm struck by something Sash said, and I completely agree with, and I think is the most disturbing undercurrent here, which is that this is really about the virus. It's the stimulus packages are great for keeping the patient who's been put into a medically induced coma alive, as Paul Krugman said, but really it's all about the end of the lockdown. It's about returning things to normal in terms of economic and human activity. And the problem is we really don't know. We don't have the slightest idea. But there's a very good chance this keeps going for some time. Whether it's because there's still no sign of a vaccine for another year and a half, or any number of issues, or still no sign of an effective post-infection therapy or anything like that. So my great concern here for airlines and aviation and everything in our business is that maybe this hasn't been digested yet. Maybe people think this is another couple weeks or a month. Maybe there's no real risk here in their minds of this going on for a much longer period of time, in which case we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of economic damage. And that's really what concerns me here, because the market is reacting to stimulus packages, but it hasn't digested the actual risk that this is something more paralytic, I suppose. And to tie this into Boeing, I think this gets into the issue of what they want. They don't seem to know what they want. I think somebody said it's almost like there are two companies, one that's urgently seeking aid, and the other one that is very skeptical about aid and wants certain terms and preconditions, obviously. I think I understand, because frankly, the only reason that Boeing needs aid is if they keep the factories going and keep building jets and keep workers employed and keep paying their, suppliers, which are 70% of the cost base. If they were to decide the market has failed, this virus is going to keep that market failed for at least the next 6 months, maybe a lot longer, then they would just close factories down and probably not need a whole lot of help. But if they're deciding that this is another couple of months, we'll get through it, let's keep building jets and let's be ready for that big V-shaped recovery, then yeah, they might need assistance to tie them through that and keep making this, $3, $4, or $5 billion payment per month to keep the factories open. I don't think they know. I don't think anyone knows. And that's what's really deeply concerning here.
Ron, talk to us a little bit about Boeing, and Sash, want to get your take as well about where sort of the company is now, because 737 obviously is key, depleted quite a lot of the company's cash as that signature product line has remained grounded. We've talked about the concern that, and this I think ramps into the Airbus part of the conversation as well, right? That folks would cancel 737 orders and pick up Airbus orders that may now be canceled as well, right? Because the Airbus just announced a 40% rate cut of its own. Sort of give us your sense on where Boeing is right now, and also the news flow on where we stand on MAX recertification. And Sash would like to get your take on Boeing as well, and then maybe you can then ramp us into the Airbus conversation as well.
Yeah. So this week there was a couple news events on the 737. One was the so-called certification flight shifted from April to May. That made it out into the press, and that there also might be one or two more issues with the flight control computer on the aircraft, although there wasn't much specification on that. And sadly, the situation on the MAX has really sort of gotten swept under the carpet, or should I say the carpet of the coronavirus, right? So 737 MAX is still an ongoing thing. What's different about Boeing's position in this downturn vis-a-vis Airbus is they haven't delivered a 737 MAX in over a year, right? And many of those aircraft under the contractual terms and the material adverse change clause that airlines have once the aircraft is about a year late. In fact, I think it's 9 months to a year, depends on how the contracts are written. They can walk away from those aircraft without penalty. So it makes delivering those aircraft into a soft market a trickier endeavor. So if Airbus is finding trouble delivering A320s that arguably are not a year late and have that MAC clause hasn't been executed or triggered on their contracts, if it's difficult for Airbus, this is going to be really difficult for Boeing, and it would seem anyway almost a no-brainer for an airline that doesn't need the capacity today to just defer. Ultimately, my operating assumption, and I think most people are, this too will pass eventually. Airlines are ongoing entities. They've got to get through this. It's going to hurt, but they do have fleet plans and they have to think about that. So short of a bankruptcy, I would imagine many airlines just want to defer taking their aircraft, and it's an easy deferral to make. The other point I would make is where Airbus, and Sash will talk about this in more detail, has to cut production rates on their narrow body. Boeing can't. they're at zero right now in terms of deliveries and production rates. So they can't go negative per se, exactly, right? So it's, the positioning is a little bit different. But I think, that kind of wraps it up for Boeing. It's just going to be much more difficult to deliver those aircraft into this market. And then the other thing that complicates it even more, from a leasing perspective, the feedback I've gotten from many of the lessors I've spoken to is nobody wants to be the first company to put these airplanes up for lease, because you're hearing lease rates that are quoted that are anywhere from a third to 40% below a typical monthly lease rate, and nobody wants to be the first guy to do that. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see deferrals or even cancellations out of the lessor community. Avalon, big leasing company, they canceled some 737s. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more of that out of the leasing community because of that. So I think that's where Boeing stands, at least with the 737.
And now a word from our sponsor. The Defense and Aerospace Report is brought to you by the Bell V-280 Valor, bringing the mission technology of the future to the battlefield of today. Visit bellflight.com for more.
Could I just start by asking a question of Ron and Richard, which is, why does it make any sense for Boeing to restart the MAX line? There are 800 MAXes that need to be redelivered. At the current rate of demand, that's probably about 4 years worth of demand. Restarting the line and going through the redelivery process would seem to me to be a way to turn what is going to be a really unpleasant downturn into a commercial disaster. And I simply don't understand why Boeing doesn't, clearly finish the certification or recertification of the MAX, but not restart the line and focus on those 800 aircraft.
I think it's as simple as they have to keep some level of production, because if they were to shut down the line for multiple years, the restart would be even harder, and then the impact on the supply chain, particularly on the smaller suppliers that are very tied to that program, would be pretty much catastrophic. So and Richard, I'd be interested to hear your view on this. It seems like really not making the airplane for another year or so is probably more detrimental to the program than having some inventory floating around, even if it's at a low rate.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But, there's two other things to think about. One is that there's still the myth of the V-shaped recovery that's out there. And God knows there are houses like IKEA and whatever else that are saying, oh, yeah, you could see a strong traffic recovery in May or June or something like that. So it could be there's still people holding out hope for some kind of miraculous turnaround in the second half of the year. Even the IATA assumption, which is 40% traffic down or 38%, which is catastrophic, still assumes something happens in the year that is better than the current, what are we at, 80% down or something like that. So implicit in that number is something of a V. And there might be that belief, but also, that sort of a related point to what Ron said about it's good to have some kind of activity going on. It's also important to get the machines working again. This is something the operations people have told me time and time. Again, you can't just fire blanks, as they say. You need to use the Brogy machines and whatever else in an actual manufacturing role at some point. Otherwise, they start to just deteriorate, rust, fall apart, whatever. And once you start doing that, the minimum economic rate is probably about, 20 per month, something like that. So it's better to put these things into, just park them if necessary, because on top of the 800 jets you're talking about, that's probably where some of them will go, or lease them at not particularly advantageous rates or something. Anything is better than watching things crumble and not being prepared for when things do eventually recover.
And one thing I might add to put the scope of this in perspective, at least from a kind of a very US centric point of view, we track the movements through the TSA checkpoints. It's data that anybody can get. The TSA publishes it. And what's kind of nice about it is it's real time. You get it every day. And what we've seen happen is movements through the TSA. So true US, folks flying, it's down 95%. So roughly speaking, this time of year, you'd see about 2.3 million to 2.4 million movements through the TSA per day. What we're seeing now is 90 to 100,000. So we're down 95 to 96% in terms of true air traffic. That's just a mind-numbing number, right? So to Richard's point of, how deep this is and how long this could last, that's just really a humongously negative number. I mean, that's an obvious statement, but just like, wow, 95%. You don't really hear that a lot in our business, and that's the situation we're in, at least domestically in the US. And I think when you look in Europe, it's not too far behind.
And if you extend this and you look at the guidance coming from IATA, and they've been nothing but great about guidance. I'm not complaining about IATA at all. I think they're fantastic. But they're still saying 38% down for the year. And corresponding to 80, 90, 95, whatever it is now globally, that means there are plenty of people out there who expect there to be a solid recovery in the back half of the year.
Sash, I want to go to you. I mean, before you asked that very thoughtful question, and we took this diversion, which was important, give us your sense on the Airbus cut and what that means, because 40% is the biggest ever. As we were talking, you noted that it was the biggest cut that they've ever made as abruptly as they've made it. And is that enough of a cut, given where we think this market's going to go? Because as Ron was saying, 95% reduction in traffic is something that we've never seen before. I mean, this takes us to a completely other era of air travel.
Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. It's a huge cut. Airbus got through the last two recessions without cutting at all. They let Boeing eat the whole damn recession. They stabilized their production, and they came through in really, really good shape. And as you know, we've discussed this before. Airbus is going to have to eat some of this recession, and this is the first evidence of it. The cut is huge, 40%. It's very hard to see how Airbus can achieve that, given that even since 2008, 2009, Airbus has added production facilities. I mean, it's added capacity in Germany, it's added capacity in China, it's added new facilities in the US, and it's bought the Mirabel facility from Bombardier. So Airbus has got a much bigger fixed cost base than it had previously, and yet it's just lost 40% of its production volume. I think that's going to be really, really hard to manage. Problem is, it's not enough, and here's why. We've been doing a lot of work on Airbus's backlog and their deliveries to airlines. We've tried to look at what every airline that matters in Airbus is saying about the aircraft they want, and the honest answer is none of them want aircraft for the foreseeable future at all. And the reason why I think the claims of a V-shaped recovery are total and utter bull is that it's very hard to get people to want to fly when there is no vaccine for this virus. And until there is, and until there are limitations, i.e. you arrive in a new country and you've got to go into quarantine for 2 weeks, people just aren't going to fly, because there's no point in traveling on that basis. But so the work we've done
think once upon a time, quarantines like this were not unusual, right, for ocean liners and things like that to do. But we've become so accustomed to just getting there quickly.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely historical analogy. You're absolutely right. The thing is that those ocean liners took as many days to get from point A to point B as we now take hours. Right. And so our expectations have just completely changed. But the work we've done on Airbus's deliveries involved trying to think about how Airbus would reschedule the whole of their production system and all of their deliveries to airlines. And we played which airlines will defer, by how much, and for how long. It may not be right, but it's really interesting. The frightening thing about this process is that we got to a production rate for the A320 of only 28 a month compared to the 40 that Airbus is forecasting. And we got to production rate for the wide bodies combined of about 6 compared to, 5 to 6 compared to 8. So they've got further to go. And Airbus is now at a stage on our estimates, and these have been reasonably accurate in the past, where a quarter of their entire backlog of 7,650 aircraft is now likely to be delivered after 2027. A delivery after 2027 is just not worth the paper it's written on. That's basically never land. And so that tells us that the backlogs have very little predictive value. Actually, they have no predictive value at all, but they have very little implied financial value anymore. Post 2027, it's entirely likely we're going to be in a new aircraft program cycle anyway. They'll all get deferred again and converted into something new for delivery in the 2030s. So our view, Airbus is going to have to cut more, probably by another 25-30%. And the only thing that stopped them from doing that this time was that the system can't cope with cuts that deep as a one-off. They've got to do it in stages. But they made it very clear in their statement that these cuts protect them on both downside and upside, i.e. they can go lower as well as higher. Well, they're going to go lower.
Richard?
Yeah, it sure doesn't seem like the world could sustain 40 per month on the single aisles, that's for certain. Now, I believe they call this a 3-month adjustment, and that, of course, feeds into the myth that this is some kind of V-shaped recovery, and they could reconsider, but I think something considerably lower is coming. What's also interesting is they dropped plans to convert the Toulouse A380 line into a 321 line, and the 321 would seem to be the only jet in the world that would somehow benefit from this horror. And that's because an awful lot of people who are retiring older wide bodies are, possibly going to replace them with something that does the transatlantic or intra-Asia trip with a smaller seat count and single aisle economics, which is the 321neo. My only interpretation there is that maybe they've got so much pressure taken off the 320 in Hamburg, Tianjin, and Mobile that they can convert some of that to 321 output capacity and therefore not need the graveyard of the A380 in Toulouse to be converted into another 321 line. But either way, you can look for, of the 40 jets, I'll bet 25 or 30 will be 321s and the other 10 or 15 will be 320s.
Let me just quickly go to military spending for a moment, and whether or not we've got any update on what the impact and implications are going to be. Last week, we talked to the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Washington Democrat Adam Smith, and he said that the coronavirus is definitely going to have an impact and make a difficult defense spending future more difficult. And maybe we can start off with you, Sash, as to whether or not we're hearing any pronouncements. And certainly 10,000 Britons have died since the beginning of this crisis that almost consumed the prime minister, in fact, where folks around the world were concerned about what his fate was going to be. At the end of the day, do we know what impact this is going to have on defense spending?
Look, it would be utterly naive to think defense spending is going to be strengthened by this. It won't be. Defense just becomes less important because there's a budgetary process of triage. Other stuff becomes more important, and therefore defense becomes less important. And you can get all of this stuff about, well, the world's a dangerous place and the Chinese and the Russians and so forth. But actually, there's just a ton of spending needs to be spent on healthcare systems and on social programs, and they will take priority. Now, European militaries are doing a fantastic job. We talked last week about the cooperation between France and Switzerland and the degree to which French military helicopters are flying patients from Switzerland for treatment. There's a huge amount of work being done by the airlift fleets in Europe to bring PPE into Europe, but also to fly patients around. That's super stuff. I mean, the most inspiring example in the UK, the British Army built a 4,000-bed field hospital in the Excel Centre that those of us who attend the DSEI show, defence show, every 2 years know and love very well. Well, that's now a hospital. It's an enormous hospital. They did it in a week. That's great. But none of that protects defence spending, and nobody should kid themselves it does. Defence spending is going to be flat at best, unlikely down in absolute terms, because there are bigger priorities for the money.
Richard, do you see an impact, and particularly on the F-35 program? Because if you look at Commandant David Berger's new guidance, he makes it pretty clear that we need fewer F-35s, and there are many people who regarded the Marine Corps as the service that helped save the F-35 a couple of years ago when things were not looking good for the program at the end of the day. Talk to us about where you see not just the coronavirus impact, but also the change in strategy impact and how that affects potentially major air programs. And Ron, want to get your sense on that as well before we sort of wrap it up.
Yeah, there's a big difference between U.S. and European views in defense spending. And we, I think, tend to view the defense budget, if anything, as a bit of a stimulus package of itself. And there's no link really between macroeconomics and defense spending in the U.S. And God knows in the context of how many trillions of stimulus dollars versus a procurement budget in the 170 billion class, it's not really clear what difference it would make. So, you'll look to see additional planes, basically shovel-ready stimulus type of aircraft, 15s, 18s, thrown into the budget, probably some helicopters too. The Marine F-35 thing, that was interesting. I'm not so sure it was a dig against the F-35, because if you look at what they cut, I believe it was C's, not B's. And that seemed to say it's more of a basing strategy thing and getting away from ground bases and more of a mobile amphibian sort of approach, which maybe won't hurt the bees at all and will probably favor other systems. But,
but a cut is a cut, right? That's the first cut to the 35 pipeline.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the 35 short-term intake by the Marines hasn't been affected, won't be affected. In the long run, it will be. Right. But, how much of the F-35 program had that kind of long-term, oh, come on, was the Air Force really going to take 1,763 A models, or is it just a matter of time before they make that announcement? So, there's a whole bunch of that stuff sort of baked into the program. What matters is in the here and now for the next few years, they'll be building at max capacity, 150, 160 a year, of which 2/3 or 60% are for U.S. requirements and the rest for international customers. In other words, I don't think the short-term budgetary exigencies are going to have an impact on F-35 output. What we're really looking at is just the long-term economics of the program that we can probably see the full impact of 6, 7, 8, 10 years hence.
Especially as European allies come under more fiscal pressure. Ron, last point?
Yeah, I agree with Richard completely. I mean, the F-35 is a great example. It's fabricated, at least parts from it come from all 50 states, right? So when you think about, an alternative stimulus program, F-35 is an example of that, right? And I think that's one of the key differences among many between U.S. defense spending and European defense spending. At this point, at least in the short to medium term, I really don't worry about the impact of the stimulus spending that'll have on defense. Longer term, right? We're in the late stages of a defense upcycle, right? Year 6, pushing year 7. These things go on for maybe 8 to 10 years. So we're getting towards the end of a defense cycle, but that's completely independent of the stimulus.
30 seconds, Richard. It's yours. Swan song for Woodward, Hexcel, and your funny Lufthansa, and you have exactly 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah, 2 names pulled at a hat, it's not a surprise that thing went away, that merger. Also, Lufthansa announcing kind of an estate sale for planes that nobody ever should have had. That was amusing. Like major capacity cuts, an A340 or most of their A340s, the only plane that ever relied upon the natural curvature of the Earth's surface in order to get airborne. So in a time when actual useful planes are being parked, it was nice to see somebody, basically holding an antique sale.
Okay. Guys, thanks very much for joining us. Hope you have a very, very great holiday. Looking forward to having you guys back on next week. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Argo.
Great to be here.
And thanks very much for joining us this week. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DefAero Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we hope everybody has a very happy Easter. We'll see you tomorrow, and in the meantime, stay well.